Is President Biden's $6 trillion budget the biggest problem facing our nation? Join me in this week's Libertarian Angle as I examine that question. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective in a very principled and uncompromising way on the burning issues of the day. Well, we've got out of control federal spending big time now under the Biden administration. Everybody knew it was going to happen, and now with a democratically controlled Congress, there's nothing stopping the out of control spending. They're talking about a $6 trillion budget. I mean, this is incredible. A deficit of almost $2 trillion a year. The national debt is climbing $29 trillion. It's incredible. I mean, these people, there are no controls on them whatsoever anymore. And we all know what's coming around the corner. The Federal Reserve is going to accommodate all this debt through the printing of money. You're going to see an inflationary debasement of the currency. We've seen this over and over again through the decades. Ever since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, ever since the Franklin Roosevelt administration nationalized gold, which had been the official money of the American people under the Constitution for 150 years or so. And he nationalizes gold, makes it illegal to own it, a felony. It was just incredible. And they go on this paper money standard that opened up the floodgates for federal spending. And so what they're doing now is just continuing this syndrome that's gone on for decades, but they're doing it super big time. And this cannot end well. I mean, this thing's going to end up in a very bad place with an economic crisis, a financial crisis. It's just a matter of when. It's not a question of if. It's impossible to predict the exact time that it'll happen, but it's inevitable. I mean, these people think that you can just spend a nation rich, that a government can spend a nation rich. That's never happened ever in the history of the world. Governments spend their nations into bankruptcy. Just talk to the people of Greece, talk to the people of Cuba, of Russia, Venezuela. Massive federal spending, and it pushes the country into bankruptcy and impoverishes the people. I mean, this is the secret of poverty. If you want an impoverished nation, if you want widespread poverty, just have government have uncontrolled spending. And that's what we've got now. But this isn't really the root of the problem. I mean, it's like a very strong branch of the problem. This idea that government controls the monetary system, the paper money system, the ability to spend as much money as they want, to incur as much debt as they want. There's no question that that's a huge branch of the root. But my opinion is that the real root of this problem is your government school system, our government school system. I mean, that's where the real rot is taking place with respect to this, at least part of it. That this is where the indoctrination takes place. I mean, if you look at the mainstream press's reaction to this federal spending, it's like ho-hum. I mean, most of them believe that this is the right thing to do. Oh, Jacob, infrastructure. Oh, stimulus, Jacob. Oh, minimum wage and guaranteed annual income. And they all just buy into this. I mean, they know about Cuba. They know about Venezuela. It doesn't bother them because they're convinced that President Biden knows best because he's the president. The Democrats know best because they're the Democratic Party, that they really have a handle on financial matters and economic matters. And it never occurs to them that this is what politicians have done here in the United States, at least since the Roosevelt administration. They spend money in the short term to buy votes, to get devotion, and gets everybody all excited, because, they're priming the pump with all this money. And then the crash inevitably comes, like it did in 1929. And all of a sudden, the failure of free enterprise, And we're going to see it again. We saw it in 2008, where you had the inevitable crash. And who do they blame? Not the government. Oh, it's never the government. No, it's not their fault. It's, those rapacious lenders, those banksters, and all this other kind of nonsense. Well, the problem is that the mainstream press believes in this. I mean, they defer to the authority of the Democrats, of President Biden, that they must know best. And, unfortunately, many Americans just go right along with what the mainstream press and Biden and the Democratic Party wants. They think they're the experts, and they just defer to their authority. It just doesn't compute in their mind that these people are sending them into bankruptcy, into massive monetary debasement. And the reason for that mindset is rooted in public schooling, government schooling. That's where the indoctrination takes place. You start out in the first grade, and you're told, it's ingrained in you, that this is a free country, that this is a capitalist system. And that's year after year after year. You pledge allegiance with liberty and justice for all, So there's no doubt in your mind that you live in a free country. The indoctrination is so deep and so profound, year after year, day after day in this system. And it's not just the formal public schools. It's also many of the private schools that are government licensed. They have to get their licenses renewed. And they buy into all this. A lot of the school teachers, the administrators, especially the one on school vouchers, because they want to keep their voucher program going. So the indoctrination is very much there as well. So you end up with an entire generation of people that are graduating that just defer to the authority here of President Biden, of the Democrats, of the Federal Reserve, the Department of the Treasury. Oh, they must know what they're doing, Jacob. We have to defer to their authority. And it's that indoctrination that I hold is the real root of the problem. And it's not just monetary affairs and financial affairs. It's also with respect to the warfare side of this thing. We've got the welfare state side, and we've got the warfare state side, or what can also be called the national security state side, consisting of a massive military establishment, massive and omnipotent CIA, an organization that's got the power to assassinate people. That's incredible. And then the NSA, the power to conduct secret surveillance on people. And it's all billed as part of America's capitalist system, part of our free enterprise system. It's all just like one package, the Federal Reserve, the debasement of the currency, the massive spending. This is capitalism. And you see the left saying this oftentimes. They indict America's capitalist system, and they incorporate that with the national security establishment. That they talk about the forever wars and the interventions, and some of them are pretty good at it on the left in terms of condemning America's system of foreign interventionism, at least selective interventionism. Most of them like interventionism. They just don't like the results of this one versus that one. But they all consider it part of America's capitalist system, so they attack capitalism and say, see what capitalism has done. It's given us this forever war in Afghanistan. And all of this is rooted in public schooling. That's the mindset that they get from the first grade, that America has a capitalist system. It's a free enterprise system. And there's just layers upon layers of indoctrination that take place over a very long, 18 years or 12 years. It's like a 12-year jail sentence because, I often say that public schooling is like Army Light. It really does resemble the Army. You essentially have conscription. You've got parents that are coerced to send their kids into the system. Now, obviously, nowadays, parents have options. They can homeschool. They didn't have that back in the 1950s. Everybody was forced to send their kids into public schools unless they had the money for the private schools, and most people don't have that kind of money, so they have to default. But what's important to understand about public schooling is that it's a government-controlled system. So we're not just talking about public schools themselves, but the government licensed schools. Many of the homeschoolers have to submit their curriculum for approval from the state. So it's a government-supervised, government-controlled, government-managed system. And people are coerced into this. Like I say, some people have options. Homeschooling is not an option for a lot of people. That people don't feel competent to homeschool, and with some justification, they don't feel like this is their cup of tea, so they default to the public school system, and so they end up with a kid that is fully indoctrinated, and the parent can't see the indoctrination because the parent himself is a victim of this indoctrination. You've got layers upon layers upon layers of indoctrination that this is a free country. This is a free enterprise system. the military, the CIA, and the NSA are part of our free enterprise system. The Department of Defense is about defending America, despite the fact that all these wars are taking place thousands of miles away from America. But everybody buys it. I mean, it's like, oh, yes, Jacob, they're just defending America. Because, look, it's called the Department of Defense. It's not called the Department of War or the Department of Empire or the Department of Aggression or the Department of Interventionism or the Department of Coup or the Department of Assassinations. It's the Department of Defense. So all of these interventions and assassinations and coups and invasions, it's just defending America. And people believe it. I mean, they honestly believe it. And that's because of these layers upon layers upon layers of indoctrination. Now let me share with you my personal story of breaking through this indoctrination. I grew up as a Democrat. I grew up in South Texas, Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border. I was, a Democrat growing up. My father was active in Democratic Party politics. Everybody was a Democrat back then. It's just a question whether you were a conservative Democrat or a liberal Democrat. And so I bought into all this stuff. When I got back out of law school and went back to my hometown, Laredo, to practice law, I firmly was convinced that government played a legitimate role in helping the poor. I mean, there was just no doubt in my mind. Well, for one thing, I was the ACLU representative in Laredo. Just to give you my leftist credentials here, I was on the Legal Aid Board of Trustees. This was an organization that provided free legal services to the poor. And it always befuddled me why anybody would oppose government helping poor people. I mean, I just couldn't understand that mindset, because the way I figured it, government has its own money. Why shouldn't it be free to spend its money the way it wants? And what's wrong with using one's money to help the poor? So, I bought into this notion that the government is just another actor in the marketplace. Well, this is a result of indoctrination. Oh, but most important, there was no doubt that I lived in a free country. I mean, none. I grown up during the Vietnam War, and we were all told during the Vietnam War that the troops were over there dying to protect our freedom. And up to about my junior year in college, I bought into that. I really believed it was true. The sort of the same mindset that goes on with the war on terrorism today, that we got to go kill them over there, Jacob, before they come and kill us over here. Because the mindset was the communists were coming to get us. They were going to take over the country. There was a red wave coming. There was supposedly an international. This was the thrust of the whole Cold War, that there was supposedly an international communist conspiracy, supposedly based in Moscow, Russia. Yes, the same Russia we're supposed to treat as our enemy today, and that this conspiracy was designed to take over the world, including the United States, and that if America wasn't converted to a national security state with omnipotent powers, including the power of assassination, that we couldn't preserve our freedom, and that this would be part of our free society. So by the time I was a junior in college, I saw through this nonsense, and I turned against the war. But overall, I still believe that we live in a free society. I had no doubts. And I remember a friend of mine from Laredo with whom I had gone to junior high and high school, and he had gotten back to Laredo about the same time, and he was a finance major. He had gone to the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Finance. Brilliant guy, good friend. And he gave me a book called A Time for Truth by a man named William Simon. I was about 27 or so. And Simon was the Treasury Secretary under Reagan. And as I'm reading this book, it's talking about the concept of economic liberty, how we need to restore economic liberty, how the government had destroyed economic liberty. I don't remember the specifics, but that was the general thrust of the book. It was a good book, well written, but I remember going back and telling my friend, I said, Jack, it's a nice book, it's interesting, but what's all this stuff about liberty and freedom and restoring liberty and freedom? I said, that's really weird, because we live in a free society. This guy, is a little bit, off here. And then, I guess probably maybe a year later or less, I decided to go into the public library and look for something to read. And so I went to the political science section, and I got I saw these 4 little different colored books on a lower shelf there, and they were called Essays on Liberty, volumes 1 through 4. So I picked up volume 1, I started thumbing through it, and I tell you, I've told this to people before. This was a true road to Damascus experience. I mean, I was just stunned at what I was reading. Now these were hardcore, pure, no compromise essays on libertarianism, especially in the economic sphere. They had been published some 20 years before that by the Foundation for Economic Education, whose president, I'm sure most of you know, was Leonard E. Read. Well, I'm reading these things, and I mean, I knew my life was changing. I was a trial attorney, but man, I was just flabbergasted. I mean, I was so bowled over what I was reading. I checked out all 4 books, and I took them home and just poured over them. I think I read them about 4 times because I could feel the layers of indoctrination, this thick thing that was clouding my mind, cracking apart. It was the most amazing experience because I could tell I was breaking through to reality. I mean, these were essays by people like Ludwig von Mises and Frank Schoderoff and Leonard Read, whose writings had the biggest impact on me, and it taught me about methodology of advancing liberty. Because if somebody had asked Leonard Read back in the 50s when they published these books what the impact of those books was back in the 50s, if they had asked him in the 50s, right after the books were published, he says, like, how'd you do with the books? Well, Leonard could have said, well, we sold X number of copies and we put X number of copies in these hands or whatever. But what he couldn't say is that these books are going to impact the life of a young lawyer in South Texas 20 years from now. They're going to change the course of his life, and he's going to be advancing liberty in this movement at some point in his life. He couldn't say that because obviously, how would he know? Couldn't predict the future. But so it taught me about methodology, is that what really matters in advancing liberty is putting out a solid message, and then putting it out into the marketplace of ideas. And don't worry about it. Don't try to convince people. Don't try to buttonhole people. In the 30 some odd years that I've done FFF, I've come to at least one firm conclusion, and that is that you can't convince people of libertarianism. I mean, I've got close friends and relatives. They have absolutely no interest. And, if you can't convince the people that love you, well, forget it. You're not going to convince anybody else. So I've come to the conclusion that what we're really doing, and what FFF does, is we're looking for people. We're looking for people who naturally want to be free. And that say, wow, Jacob, what you're saying is exactly the way I feel. That's the person I want. Because then that's when we start building our numbers in this movement. Now, those of you that have been with me for a long time know that I'm totally against the idea of reform. There's the libertarian movement is predominantly reformers, or what they call pragmatists or practical-oriented people. They say, well, we've got to achieve things incrementally. The people will never go along with the libertarian package. It's too radical, and so we have to water it down. And they say, well, that's the way to advance liberty. Well, I question that. I don't think any reform of the welfare-warfare state advances liberty. It advances reform. And reform is not liberty. And the analogy, I know some of you have heard this, that I use is slavery. That if all you did was reform slavery, you're not advancing freedom. You're just improving the lot of the slaves. Let's say you get a reform that provides for no lashings anymore, and better food, better health care, and so forth. Okay, the slaves will be grateful, no doubt about it, but they will know it's not freedom. Reform is not freedom. In order to achieve freedom, you have to dismantle infringements on freedom, which means making the case for freedom. See, I believe that if you reach a critical mass of people in society that want freedom, that understand what freedom is, that it's very possible that a catalyst could come along that brings about that shift. But you have to just keep working to reach that critical mass, even though you don't know how many are in the critical mass, how many are required for it, how many are already in it. You just don't know these. You can't know it. You have to do it on faith of just putting that solid message out there with the quest of that it'll find people that are receptive to pure libertarianism instead of reformed, warmed over serfdom, and then that critical mass gets larger and larger. Now, there's no guarantee. I mean, that catalyst might never come along, but the tragedy is to give up and say, I'm going to devote my life to reform, and then the catalyst happens, and you're not there to take advantage of it because you settle for reform. And so that's what my discovery in that public library taught me is, you've got to just keep putting that solid message in the marketplace and just let it find its way. People find it and they say, hey, this has now changed the course of my life, and then you build toward that critical mass. But that's what we're looking at in terms of this public school thing, and that indoctrination that I saw cracking apart when I discovered this pure case for liberty can happen to anybody. You just don't know. Now, I know that there's reform-oriented libertarians that say, Jacob, give it up. People aren't ready for libertarianism, so we just got to settle for reform. They'll go reform. And so they advocate things like health savings accounts instead of a separation of healthcare in the state. I mean, the real objective in terms of freedom is to dismantle infringements on freedom, dismantle the structure that is preventing people from being free. And so in healthcare, that means getting government out of healthcare. It's not a matter of opposing the lockdowns, which is fine, opposing the mask mandates, which is fine, but it's just reform. It's not freedom. It's trying to preserve a milder form of serfdom, but it's not freedom. In order to achieve freedom, you need a separation of healthcare in the state. Same with religion. If we had public churching in America, it'd be as big a mess as it is in healthcare. Like with Medicare and Medicaid, now with this pandemic and stuff, it's a gigantic mess. I mean, healthcare has been in crisis ever since Medicare and Medicaid were adopted. And it would be the same thing with public churches if we had public churching in America. And the reformers would be saying, Jacob, we just got to work to, we get better preachers in the pulpits, and we've got to work on getting, the Catholic Bible instead of the Protestant Bible, and we got to deal with something about those Muslim churches or Muslim, whatever. That, in other words, reform. While then there would be those of us that say, let's go for freedom. And we'd be looking out for people that want a separation of church and state. But in order to do that, you got to make the case for separating church and state so that you find those people. If all libertarians made the case for just reforming, public churching or public schooling or healthcare, it'd be a pretty dismal thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's maybe time to pass out the cyanide capsules. Because that would be reason for despondency. The reason that there's hope for America is because there is libertarianism. And that's the way out of this morass. That's the only way we're going to get out of this morass is with libertarianism. There's no other way. I keep emphasizing that the more that libertarians spend their times advocating reform, the more they're just beating their head against the wall. They're wasting their time, their money, unless that's all they want is just a better form of serfdom. I mean, okay, I can live with that, just like people that were fighting for less lashings and better food for slaves. That was all they wanted, fine. But I want freedom, you see, and I'm one of these libertarians that has not given up because you never know what tomorrow can bring you. Yeah, things are bad. There's a $6 trillion budget here. Federal spending's out of control. There's crises everywhere, foreign policy crises, healthcare crises, government, public schooling crises. I mean, everywhere you look, there's a crisis. But notice there's a common denominator to all these crises, and that's the government. The drug war, I mean, there's another example of another crisis. And of course, what do? They never talk about dismantling the cause of all these problems, of these crises. Immigration control is another example. There's been decades-long crisis in immigration. Well, it's a socialist system. It's based on central planning. It brings death and suffering. There's along the border, there's a police state. I've had personal experience with that immigration police state. But it's that notion, oh, no, Jacob, this is freedom. Well, it's not freedom. And in order to achieve freedom, you've got to dismantle the infringements on freedom. If all you do is work to reform this thing, get rid of roving border patrol checkpoints, for example. Well, you still got the warrantless searches of farms and ranches along the border. You still have the fixed domestic highway checkpoints that are found in communist countries, along with highways in the Southwest. You've got the boarding of Greyhound buses, checking people's papers. So even though you may reform it, you still have a police state down there. And the same with the drug war. Okay, ending mandatory minimum sentences, that's a great reform. Ending asset forfeiture, great reform. But it's not freedom. And so in order to achieve freedom, we've got to break through this indoctrination. And ironically, part of this quest to accomplish this is to dismantle the public schooling system itself. And in that process, restore a faith in free markets. The free market produces the best of everything. We know that. It's our heritage. And yet look at education. This is your classic socialist system. You've got mandatory attendance laws. I mean, whenever somebody's mandating that they get customers, you know something's wrong with that system right off the bat. A good system gets customers because customers want that system. And you don't need to force people to patronize it. And then it's always a burden, whenever they get too many students. Oh my God, there's too many customers here. Please, somebody do something. And then you've got government curriculum, government established curriculum. You got government school teachers that are well intended. I mean, my sister was an elementary school teacher. Her daughter was an elementary school teacher. I was the attorney along with my father, who was an attorney. We were attorneys for the local school board. And fine people. I mean, school teachers and school administrators, but you got a bad system. And that's the thing about this thing, that if you got a bad system and you got good people, the bad system's going to win out every time. You've got central planning, which is a socialist concept, government textbooks. It's just a bad system. But the real horror is what it does to people's minds, especially, when they're small children. This indoctrination is not just a neutral thing. You've got this layer upon layer being caked all over your mind of indoctrination, of falsehood, of lies, really. Lies. That all these foreign wars are for freedom, that the war on terrorism is for freedom, that they have to spy on us for freedom, that they have to have the power of assassination because that's for freedom. I mean, these are all lies, but it's all built as part of this indoctrination system. And then there's kids who resist. I mean, it's like in the Army, most people go along, like if they're conscripted and they're drafted, they say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'll just go to Vietnam, and if I have to die, I have to die in this ludicrous cause. But there's some people that resist, just like there were people who resisted the draft. There's kids that are even small kids that instinctively know this is a bad system. And so they resist it. They don't cooperate. They walk around class. They went out. This is like a little prison to them. And what does the school do? They diagnose them as something's wrong with you. See, it never occurs to the school or to the administrators that something's wrong with them, with their system. No, the system's fine because of that layer of indoctrination that they themselves have been subjected to, the administrators and the teachers. It's something's wrong with that kid. And then they call the parents in, and the parents are the subject of this indoctrination. I mean, that's why they got the kids in this school. They think it's a great system. And so what do? They diagnose Ritalin or Adderall. And the idea of these drugs is to get these kids' minds straight. It's like a re-education that it's done in communist countries, that they're going to keep plying them with drugs, and they're going to keep regimenting them and ordering them and obedience and so forth until their mind gets straight. And then as soon as their mind gets straight, then it's going to be subject to layers and layers of indoctrination. And it's all drug-induced. The best parents are the ones that recognize that the kid's right, that the kid is sensing something's wrong, and they take their kid out of school and they find a better alternative. So it's impossible to measure the damage that's done to kids throughout this system. But we do know that we live in a nation of people that are very deferential to authority. That if Joe Biden says this $6 trillion spending thing is great, yes, it's got to be great, Jacob. I mean, we saw it with Republicans too. When George W. Bush was advocating invading Afghanistan and invading Iraq and bringing up mushroom clouds and nuclear bombs and stuff. No evidence at all. They were lying through the teeth there too. But there was that deference to authority. Jacob, they must know something that we don't know. We have to trust them. All that deference to authority comes to that regimented system of public schooling. That deference to authority, obedience to orders. That's inculcated in people from the first grade. Man, when that bell rings, you move. I don't care how excited you are about this particular subject. You better be at the next class in 10 minutes, or you're in hot water. It is not a system for learning. Learning is an exciting process. Learning is a seeking process. In fact, I think the derivation of the word educate is educare, Latin for seeking knowledge, seeking understanding. And I mean, look at libertarianism. You know, y'all are libertarians. You didn't learn libertarianism in school. They're not going to teach libertarianism in school. You know, can you imagine school teacher teaching why public schooling should be abolished? That school teacher's not going to be long for this world. And it's the same in calling for drug legalization or the abolition of the CIA and the NSA and the Pentagon, and just have a basic military force like we did throughout the 19th century. That school teacher isn't going to last. They're going to squeeze them out. The school board's going to go nuts. Parents are going to go nuts. Well, that's the system. It's a deference to authority, order, and it's highly destructive. But that's what we have to do. We have to aim high here. If we want freedom, you can resign yourself if you want to just go with vouchers, school vouchers, and say, oh, Jacob, it's just too hard. People will never go along with us. Okay. I mean, that's all you want. But if you want freedom, and I think that's what libertarianism is really all about. It's like we understand what our fellow Americans do not understand. We don't live in a free society. That's how we have broken through the layers of indoctrination. We see reality for what it is. And we understand what freedom is. We understand that it entails a dismantling, not a reform, of infringements on freedom. So we have to identify what those infringements are. And one of the massive infringements, right there at the root, maybe is the root, is public government schooling. So that's why we have to raise people's vision to a higher level. We can't just settle for reform. We have to keep making that case for separating economy in the state, separating money in the state, separating healthcare in the state, separating education in the state. We do that, and we will be well on our road to a free society. That's my message for a Libertarian Angle this week. If you're new to our organization, the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily publication, as well as to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And I look forward to seeing you all next month or next week.